Alright, so now we are heading towards more interesting chapters, finally, right? Like, for example, bone. Yeah. In this chapter, we're going to study bone, and then we have some interesting chapters coming up after this as well. So, bone. Well, bones are what? Part of the skeletal system. Yeah, they help form our skeletons, they help us in support, they help us in shape, they help us in movement, they help different passages for nerves, for blood vessels, for other organs, they help protect other organs, and very, very important is they help in movement and shock absorption, etc., etc. So we know what bones are. We have learned them in anatomy. There's so many different bones, 206 bones in total in our body. So the question arises as to how do bones appear under a microscope? What are bones actually made up of? What are the cells of the bone? What are the components on a cellular level of bone? And that is exactly what we are going to cover in this chapter, okay? Alright, so without any further ado, let's jump right to it. I have this diagram that I've taken out for you, and I want to go about the molecular structures of the bone firstly through this. So what do we know about the bone? This diagram is of a very common bone. It is basically the largest bone in the body. And can you guess what this diagram, this bone is? Well, a hint is that it is the largest bone in the body. Which is it? It is obviously the femur, right? So we have this diagram of femur. We have the head of the femur, neck of the femur, the greater trochanter right here, the shaft of the femur, whatever. Okay, we have the cross section. In this cross section, immediately what we see is two different types of bones. We have a very compact structure on the boundaries over here. Yeah, I'm highlighting this. I think I should highlight it instead of drawing it blue. So this right here. Alright, this right here on the boundaries you see is a very, very compact structure. It's a very compact bone, and this is actually, the name is the same. It's called the compact bone, okay? It's a very hard, without any gaps between it. It's very compact in shape, and it's called a compact bone. While the one in the middle, you see here, it's called the spongy bone. Both of them are calcified, both of them are very, very hard. Even the spongy bone and obviously the compact bone is very, very hard as well. So both of them are quite calcified, ossified, and very hard structures. Now between them is a cavity, right? So between the compact bone, maybe you have a compact bone right here, and then there's a cavity between it, yeah? Compact bone right here, then we have the spongy bone, and inside, well, the spongy bone, because it's like a sponge, so you expect that there's cavity in between the spongy bone, and that is called the medullary cavity of the bones, okay? It's called the cavity is called the medullary cavity. And any guesses as to what medullary cavity contains? What does it contain? Of course, the bone marrow, right? The bone marrow. Excellent. Okay, so what is the bone marrow? The bone marrow is the stuff that is present inside the medullary cavity, inside the bones. Okay, there's two kinds of bone marrows. Who knows the two kinds? Well, first of all, we have the yellow bone marrow, right? And then we have one of the most important things in our body, red. Gonna change the pen size. Give me a bit. Okay, red bone marrow, right? Red bone marrow. Okay, any guesses as to the functions of yellow and red bone marrows? Well, the yellow bone marrow contains a store of fats. Okay, it contains fats. It also has mesenchymal stem cells that can form new bone and cartilage. Okay, so mesenchymal stem cells can divide to form cells of the bone and cells of the cartilage. So that's what the yellow bone marrow function is. And the reason why it's colored yellow is because of the fats and the fatty deposits and basically the adipocytes that are present inside the yellow bone marrow, and it appears very yellow. Similarly, we have a red bone marrow that is present inside the medullary cavity of the bone. Red bone marrow is a site for hemopoiesis, site of hemopoiesis. And hemopoiesis is basically the process through which blood cells form, especially immune cells. So for example, we have different kinds of immune cells like lymphocytes and phagocytes and eosinophils, basophils, neutrophils. We also have red blood cells, right? We also have platelets. All of them form inside red bone marrow in a process called hemopoiesis. And there's a chapter in histology of hemopoiesis. We study this chapter later on in this series, and I will teach you what hemopoiesis is, how it occurs, how the cells look under histology slide, everything. So yeah, just wait until we get there. Okay, so in the previous chapter, right now we have studied that the bone has two kinds of bones. There's two kinds of bones. There's compact bone and spongy bone, right? Compact bone and spongy bone, and between them is a medullary cavity that contains the bone marrow, the yellow and the red bone marrow. Yeah, and the function of yellow and red bone marrow that I just went over. Now, just like in the previous chapter, we had the cartilage, and the cartilage was surrounded by, usually surrounded, not in all cases, and I told you the exceptions, but generally it was surrounded by a dense connective tissue called the perichondrium, and the cells of cartilage were the chondrocytes, and it was surrounded by perichondrium. Similarly, in bones, we have the cells are called osteocytes. Okay, so osteocytes are the mature cells of the bone, and the bone is surrounded by a tissue called the periosteum. Chondrocyte, perichondrium, osteocyte, periosteum. Okay. Now this periosteum is present on both the outer surface of the bone. So for example, let's look at this diagram right here. There's the outer surface of the bone, right? And then there's the inner spongy bone, right? And the spongy bone on the inside also is surrounded by a periosteum, and inside it's called the endosteum. On the outside is called the periosteum, while on the inside is called the endosteum. Okay, there's another difference between the two, is that periosteum, which is present on the outside, but basically the same thing, is that it is made up of two different layers. Firstly, we have a fibrous layer on the outside, so I'm going to show you like this. This is the fibrous layer of the periosteum, which is basically an outer layer, and then it has an inner layer. An inner layer would look something like this. It's got these cells that you cannot really see in this diagram. It's very light, but it's got these cuboidal cells lining the outside of the bone. So the outer periosteum is like this. These cells, by the way, are called these are the progenitor cells for the osteocytes. So what do you think would they be called? Well, the progenitor cells for the chondrocytes were called chondroblasts. So what do you think the progenitor cells for the osteocyte should be called? Obviously osteoblasts, right? And these cells are called osteoblasts as well. Excellent. Okay, now this layer of cell, the osteoblast layer that is present inside the periosteum, the cellular layer of periosteum, is a cuboidal layer. Remember, we studied what cuboidal cells are in the epithelium chapter. Well, this is an example of it. So it's a cuboidal layer lined with cells called osteoblasts, which are basically progenitor cells for the bone cells, the osteocytes. And they also help produce the bone matrix and the bone components. We will study more detail about them in just a bit. This is just an introduction to the osteoblasts. Okay, so we just learned that the outer layer surrounding the bone on the outside is called the periosteum, while the inner layer is called the endosteum. right? So the inner layer is called the endosteum, which surrounds the bone on the inside. Like for example, the spongy bone, which is present on the inside, is surrounded by endosteum instead of periosteum. Now the difference between endosteum and periosteum is that endosteum only has one layer, okay? Periosteum had two layers, a fibrous layer and a cellular layer, while endosteum only has one layer, okay? The cells of both periosteum and endosteum are the same. They contain the osteoblasts that we went over just now. They contain the osteoclasts. We'll study more about them in just a bit, but osteoclasts are basically cells that are responsible for resorption of bone, for basically absorbing the bone, for degradation of bone, and they help absorb the stuff that is present inside the bone matrix, the hard part of the bone. So that's what osteoclasts do, while osteoblasts do the opposite. They secrete the bone matrix and they become part of the bone when they mature as osteocytes. Osteocytes are not present inside the endosteum or the periosteum. Osteocytes are the mature osteoblasts that are part of the bone matrix itself. These are not progenitor cells, these are the mature bone cells. Alright, and then we have also some osteogenic cells. These divide to form different types of cells of the endosteum. These are not very important, so I'm going to like erase this. Alright, so now let's jump into the more interesting part, yeah? The bone matrix and the actual bone, right? Well, the bone matrix, as you can see, is this hard part of the bone, and then it is surrounded by these squished in cells that we see here. These are absolutely squeezed by the bone matrix, and these are it seems like they're pressed from all the sides, and they're just surviving inside this really tough bone matrix that is very crystally, and it's very hard and compact. So this is the bone matrix. I'll write this down, bone matrix, yeah? And the cells that it contains between the bone matrix are the osteocytes. These are the cells, the mature bone cells that exist within the bone matrix. Now, what does the bone matrix contain that makes it so hard and so compact and so rigid? Well, the bone matrix contains collagen and some glycoproteins and proteoglycans and some crystals. So, let's go over with the collagen first. Well, what collagen do you think is present inside the bones? I think I have discussed this in the connective tissue chapter, where we have the disease called osteogenesis imperfecta. It was a disease caused by a mutation in the production of collagen type 1. Okay, so and it was basically osteogenesis imperfecta basically translates as abnormal or imperfect bone formation. Osteo, bone, genesis, formation, imperfecta, imperfect bone formation, abnormal bone formation results because of mutation in collagen type 1. So, which collagen is present inside the bone matrix? That should be clear by now. It is collagen type 1. All right. What else is present in the bone matrix? Well, we have lots and lots of proteoglycans. There's a very common glycoprotein that is also present inside the bone matrix. I think you should know, you should remember this. I'm going to write this down. It's called the osteocalcin. We're going to look at it in just a bit. Its function in the bone matrix when we study bone formation, it basically helps to bring in the calcium. Okay, it brings in the calcium ions and helps form the bone matrix, helps in ossification basically. So we have collagen type 1, we have proteoglycans, we have osteocalcin, and the most important part that is really rigid, the crystal part basically, are called hydroxyapatite crystals. Hydroxyapatite crystals. These are crystals that are basically formed between calcium ions and phosphate ions, and we will study that in just a bit. These are arranged in lamellae that we're going to look at in just a bit, and that's pretty much it for the bone matrix. So it contains type 1 collagen, hydroxyapatite crystals, and some proteoglycans, and a glycoprotein called osteocalcin, which basically brings in the calcium to make the bone, to form these crystals basically, and to make the bone more rigid. Alright, then we have the osteocytes. Osteocytes are the most common types of cells present inside bone tissue. These are present inside their own lacunae, just like the chondrocytes. These are also present inside their own lacunae, inside the bone matrix. So these are present inside the bone matrix, not outside on the periosteum, on the endosteum, but inside the bone matrix itself. And these are connected to each other by lacunae as well. So they have this lacunae, a free-flowing lacunae through which they can transfer stuff from one cell to another, and these are called canaliculi. These canals are called canaliculi. Going to show you a better diagram of them in just a bit. But these are the osteocytes. The osteocytes are mature cells of the bone, and these exist within their own lacunae, and these are present, and these contain these little canaliculi, little canals through which they can transfer materials from one cell to another. And okay, that was the introduction to the bone chapter. Yeah, quite a long introduction, but hopefully very, very interesting. Alright, so now that we are done with the introduction of bone, we're going to jump into more detailed stuff. What is the bone system? What's going on in the bone system? How is everything interacting with each other? And how do bones, basically different components of bones, interact with each other? How's stuff working? How is it forming a system of this matrix, this calcium-containing matrix that also helps, if you have studied physiology, you might have learned that it helps in regulating the blood calcium levels as well. So how's stuff going on inside the bone? And for that, we are going to use this gigantic diagram that shows stuff in 3D in a very wide angle perspective. So don't be shocked by this diagram. It's not that overwhelming. I'm going to take you step by step through the whole process, and I'm going to dictate every single thing that you need to know step by step. So don't be overwhelmed, okay? All right, so let's just zoom in and see what it shows. Okay, so here, immediately you should be able to see some of the stuff that we have already studied in the introduction. So the first thing that we studied was the two different kinds of bones, right? The compact and the spongy bone, right? So here is the compact bone, right? This entire thing is the compact bone. Well, can you see the spongy bone, or the cancellous bone, as we call it? Yeah, on the right side. So we have the spongy bone right here. Okay, and then what's surrounding on the outside, what's lining the outside of the compact bone, that is the periosteum, and that is present right here. Yeah, so immediately you should be able to see these three important landmarks. First of all, we have the cancellous bone, then we have the compact bone, and then we have the periosteum.